Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. A travesty, a license to kill, propping up a craven tyrant. With rare exception, world leaders have been unsparing this week in their condemnation of Russia and China's decision to veto a UN Security Council resolution aimed at halting the bloodshed in Syria. Now, the UN stalemate has left Russia scrambling to broker a diplomatic solution with a leader, Bashar al-Assad, that most of the world, including many of Assad's Arab neighbors, have given up on. Many are already dismissing Russia's gambit as much too little, too cynical, and too late. Now, my guest today is Julian Barnes-Dacey. He's a Middle East, North Africa specialist at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's joining me from London. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here. Julian, I want to get right to the thick of this. You pose a rather provocative question in a recent blog of yours. You asked, why not call Russia's bluff? Why not have the international community back its effort to sponsor peace talks in Moscow between Assad and the opposition? Wouldn't talking to the Syrian regime, no matter how odious it might seem to some of us, wouldn't it weaken Assad's position? I'd like you to start with that. That generally is your argument, that the talks might fail, but they would expose the weaknesses of both sides.
Sure. I mean, I think absolutely that at the moment we're really looking down a pessimistic path, and there are really so few options on the table. So I think any offers out there need to be maneuvered with, need to be played with. And if Russia is saying that we want to sponsor some talks, let's get them in a room together. Let's get Assad there. And I think if we can internationalize that meeting, if we can draw in the opposition, if we can draw in the regime, and we can lay out some very legitimate claims, it puts both the Russians and Assad in a tight corner. I mean, they cannot reject an end to violence. They cannot wholly reject a peaceful transition of power. So I think really by calling their bluff, by saying, OK, we're going to run with your proposal, it makes it much harder for both of them to obstruct some meaningful progress that might end violence.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, yesterday we had the negotiation between Sergei Lavrov, Bashar Assad. It's hard to really get inside Assad's mind, but what was he thinking as he sat there across from Lavrov or next to him? I don't know their position around the table. What were they actually thinking? What was going on in these negotiations? Were they saying anything to each other?
Well, I'm sure Assad was giving Lavrov the right sign. So he was saying, look, we want to do this. We want to initiate some reforms, et cetera, et cetera. I think both sides must know that this is to a fairly kind of wide degree, fairly empty talk. I mean, Assad is concerned with his survival here. You know, the regime is on the edge and they are fighting for their very life. So, you know, even as those talks were going on, his military, his security apparatus was bombarding Homs to try and repel the protesters. So I think, I mean, there's this sense of denial, really. Yes, we will move towards reform, but fundamentally they have taken a decision to go down the security route, which is why I think really there's an argument to be made for embracing the Russian proposals, which might force the Russians to put pressure on Assad to come to the negotiating table.
What are, though, you were talking about there's really so few other options. What do you see as being the other options? If we don't sort of back this Russian diplomatic effort, what are some other viable ways forward?
Well, I think really there are so few. I mean, to my mind, there are three. I mean, either you let the situation unfold as it's going now, and for all the strength and the bravery of the opposition, the military strength and the cohesion of the Assad regime remains strong. So I would almost argue that the balance of power remains in their favor. Or you intervene militarily, but to be honest, I think that's really off the cards, off the table. I think there's very little willpower for that because the consequences of it could be so dynamic and devastating in terms of promoting a wider and more regionalized civil war. Or there's a third option, which is, you know, it's not an option you'd like to go down the path of, but that's negotiating with the regime, saying actually the international community needs to get in the middle and needs to say we need a way out of this. There needs to be an end to this horrific violence. And actually, if it forces everyone to come to the table to actually, you know, acknowledge that they must stop using those security forces, I think it might be a positive first step. Assad, will he really engage in any meaningful negotiation? We don't know. Unlikely. But let's at least give it a shot.
We've talked a lot this week about the world community, the world opinion sort of stacked against this regime and Assad. But we're forgetting, it seems he also has some pretty sizable allies still in this region, and they don't seem to be going away. Among them, I suppose, Iran, Iraq, even Lebanon.
Absolutely. I mean, the Iranians, the Iraqis, the Russians, I mean, they have all offered support. And I think so long as there is not international consensus firmly opposed to Assad, it will continue to give him room to maneuver both diplomatically and materially.
So do you see the possibility, if Assad were to go, and this has been an argument we have heard again and again from pundits and everyone else, the instability that this would trigger across the region? This is not Libya. If the Syrian regime were to go, Assad's regime, we could have a wave of violent instability.
Sure. I mean, I think we're on the verge of that violent instability as it is. And I think, frankly, if he survives, we're headed down that direction. And a civil war looks increasingly inevitable. If he was to fall, I think there would be a respite. There might be pause for thought. You know, there might be a moment of opportunity to pull things back from the brink. But clearly, if you look at the divisions in the opposition, if you look at the international, the regional influences that are being played out on Syria, there is a significant prospect of instability. But my biggest worry is a descent into civil war, a fight between the opposition and Assad that becomes regionalized. And I think that is the greatest fear in terms of regional instability.
Julian, I mean, we keep talking about, you know, about being on the brink of civil war or, you know, degenerating into civil war. We're in civil war, are we not, right now in Syria? I mean, what more do we need to sort of label this as a bona fide civil war?
Sure. I mean, I think we are in civil war, yes, but I think, you know, we're probably still at a low-level civil war. I think that, you know, once we start fully militarizing the opposition, whether it be the West or the Gulf, once those arms start flowing in on a more heavy-duty basis, I think we're talking about something much more significant. And then the potential for violence to spread into Iraq, into Lebanon, and to really engulf the country like it did Lebanon in the 1980s is something that becomes much more frightful. You know, the potential for the country to fragment, for warlordism, for really a civil war to entrench itself much more painfully upon the country than we're seeing right now. And
until now, we've had sort of the image of a lot of rebellion throughout the countryside. Now, we've seen in recent days sort of coming in around Damascus through the suburbs. How much longer the big cities, Damascus, Aleppo, how much longer are they going to remain sort of bastions of Assad's support, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, the suburbs of Damascus have been on fire for months now, and really, you know, that is the heart of the revolution, the poorer Syrians who live in the suburbs. The center of Damascus is a different story. I mean, it's heavily militarized. Security presence is hard. Those that are there are much more liable to show some support for the regime, whether it be for desire for stability, whether it be financial and business links. But of course, the longer this goes in, the more we are seeing the signs of unrest going to the heart of the city, the heart of the regime. And really, if it's not something that is already engulfing the city, it can't be long before we see something along those lines.
So the situation, it seems, and we've heard about growing privation within Damascus itself, trouble getting basic foodstuffs and supplies, and then what you need for daily life. Could this, in your opinion, sort of turn on a dime? Could you have support one day and just crumbling the next?
I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, this is a regime that is maintaining itself on the basis of fear, but on the basis of its security presence. So I think if there was to be any sense that that was to be withdrawn, I think you would see a much wider eruption of discontent and opposition. But for the moment, they are keeping it in check through this brutal security apparatus, which really is all encompassing in terms of the regime's power at the moment. I mean, that's its sole tool to keep people in line. And so I think that is still remaining a very powerful and effective tool to keep a segment of the population in line.
But it's the security forces then, and I guess, the business elite, the merchants, who continue to support Assad. Is that correct?
I think the latter, not so much. I mean, I think the business community are seeing themselves in a situation where the economy has crumbled, where they can see no future for their business opportunities in a Syria under Assad. They face sanctions, they face violence, instability. So I think that they've withdrawn their support. I mean, what we see behind Assad is that the state apparatus, which is increasingly based upon sectarian Alawite links. And then I think other minorities, Christians, other minorities who fear that they will be targeted by a Sunni Islamist-dominated post-Assad Syria. And then there is a segment of the Syrian population, whether it be elements of the business class, the middle class, who fear instability, who fear civil war, who look at Iraq, who look at Lebanon, and actually see an increasingly militarized opposition. Now, they don't support Assad out of a real desire, out of a vision of what he presents for the country, but they support him because they see his stability.
It's stability, and that's exactly it. And just to come full circle, bring this back to where we began, Russia. Do you think right now Russia's perhaps working behind the scenes? I know that the spy chief was with Lavrov in these talks, perhaps trying to find a replacement for Assad. That is, keep the regime and its mentality and its friendliness to Moscow in place, get Assad out of the picture.
There may be elements of that going on. I think the Russians feel under pressure. They want to be seen to be doing something. I think the real question is, will Assad go? Will he be prepared to step down? And frankly, who would replace him? I mean, would it be his brother? Would it be his cousin? I think all of these characters are equally odious and wouldn't be accepted by the opposition. Exactly. So it's a tricky situation. I don't think it's enough to say that Assad can take steps on his own or the regime can take steps unless you have some form of broader agreement encompassing the opposition, the international community. I don't think there's any hope.
Well, we're unfortunately going to have to leave it on that pessimistic note. For the time being, no real hope, no real bridge in prospect between the Assad regime and the opposition that is now in the 11th month of a very bloody uprising. Julian Barnes-Dacey joining us from London, Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Specialist in North Africa and the Middle East. Thank you very much for joining us and talking about the topic on everyone's minds this week, Syria and the continuing crackdown there. Thanks to all of you for watching the interview here on France 24.